In the early hours of June 22, 1941, a chilling silence over the Soviet frontier was shattered by the roar of over 3 million German soldiers, marking the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. Few could have anticipated the sheer scale of the invasion. The Wehrmacht, spearheaded by Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, surged across the borders of Belarus and Western Russia with an almost unstoppable momentum. Tanks thundered across open fields, infantry advanced in disciplined columns, and the Luftwaffe strafed villages and towns, leaving destruction in their wake. It was a moment when the world's largest nation suddenly seemed vulnerable, and the Allied powers watched with both alarm and fascination. For the British government in London, the rapid German advance was more than just a distant military campaign. It was a potential turning point that could alter the entire course of the war. Intelligence units, particularly the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, were intercepting fragmented reports from the Soviet front, telegrams of retreating units, accounts of overwhelmed border guards, and the occasional encrypted report hinting at the disarray within the Red Army. By late June, the reality was stark. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, could be threatened within months if the German juggernaut maintained its pace. The human cost of these early weeks was staggering. In the Smolensk region, Soviet rifle divisions were encircled in what would later be known as the Battle of Smolensk. Despite desperate counterattacks, entire formations were destroyed or captured. Diaries of Soviet soldiers recount a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "We did not understand why the Germans moved so fast. Our orders came too late, our reinforcements never arrived." For many on the front, the German blitzkrieg was not merely a military tactic but an existential force, a machine seemingly designed to erase entire communities from the map. Amid this chaos, the British and American intelligence communities grappled with a tantalizing and terrifying question. Could Moscow fall before the Soviets could stabilize their defenses? London sent urgent cables to embassies in neutral countries, inquiring about evacuation plans for diplomatic staff and assessing the feasibility of moving military advisors eastward. The speed of the German advance defied prior assessments. While Western Europe had already witnessed the fall of France in 1940, the potential collapse of Moscow, a city of over 4 million, was an event that could realign alliances, trigger panic in Allied capitals, and fundamentally reshape the geopolitical landscape. Within Moscow itself, Soviet authorities worked frantically to prepare for what they feared most. Troop movements were coordinated at an unprecedented scale. Reservists were mobilized, anti-tank obstacles were erected along key roads, and civilians were enlisted to dig trenches and build barricades. Yet, not all was clear from the command lines. Reports of missing officers began to emerge, high-ranking commanders who were simply unaccounted for during the chaos of retreat and redeployment. Their absence fed whispers of sabotage, internal betrayal, or perhaps covert evacuation, leaving Allied observers to wonder about the fragility of the Soviet war machine. The tension extended to the far reaches of the Allied world. British military strategists analyzed maps of the Eastern Front, calculating potential outcomes of a Soviet collapse. Some feared that if Moscow fell, Germany might redirect its forces toward the oil fields of the Caucasus or even launch a more direct pressure on the Middle East, imperiling British positions in Egypt and Iraq. Every intercepted report, every rumor of missing commanders, became a piece of a puzzle that hinted at an almost unimaginable scenario. A Europe and Asia divided before the war had truly reached its climax. As July turned to August, the Wehrmacht pressed onward with relentless determination. The summer heat and stretched supply lines did little to slow their advance, while the Soviet forces scrambled to implement defensive lines that were hastily drawn and poorly coordinated. Yet, even in the midst of retreat and uncertainty, there was resilience. Local militias resisted encroaching forces, and sporadic counterattacks by Soviet tank brigades, though often piecemeal, demonstrated that Moscow was not yet lost. For observers in London and Washington, the story was one of duality. An overwhelming enemy force on the march, countered by a nation struggling to hold its capital, while the true fate of the city remained an open, haunting question. By the end of August 1941, the first tremors of what would become the long, grueling Battle of Moscow were already palpable. German columns were within striking distance of the city's outer defensive zones, yet their momentum was shadowed by uncertainty. The resilience of Soviet command, the harshness of winter months still months away, and the shadowy disappearances of key officers created an uneasy tension. As historians would later reflect, the question was no longer merely military. It was existential. Could the Soviet Union withstand the German Blitz? Or was the world on the verge of witnessing a Moscow that might never stand again? The answer hung in the cold air, waiting to be revealed in the months to come. By October 1941, the vast expanse of Western Russia had become a landscape of shattered villages, burning forests, and frozen rivers, all testament to the German advance. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had driven relentlessly since June, cutting through Belarus and smashing through Soviet defensive lines. Now they were approaching the outskirts of Moscow, the ultimate prize of Operation Barbarossa, with panzer divisions spearheading the thrust and Luftwaffe squadrons patrolling the skies. The Soviet High Command, realizing the gravity of the situation, scrambled to reinforce the capital's defenses, calling upon every available unit, including militia, naval infantry, and hastily trained recruits. The city itself became a hive of urgency and fear, its streets echoing with the sounds of construction, mobilization, and whispered anxieties. British intelligence in London watched these developments with growing alarm. Intercepts from Soviet communications suggested that Moscow's defenses were incomplete, and there were reports of confusion among Red Army units. High-level discussions in Whitehall debated the potential consequences of a German capture of the Soviet capital. What would become of Allied plans if the Eastern Front collapsed? Was it possible to support the Soviets more directly, or would Western Europe face a vastly strengthened Nazi regime unopposed? Such questions drove covert operations in the shadows, as British agents and diplomats sought information on troop movements, evacuation plans, and the integrity of Soviet command structures. The human dimension of the battle began to emerge in letters and diaries smuggled west. A soldier in the 316th Rifle Division wrote, "Our orders change every hour. Men vanish overnight, some fleeing, some simply gone. We fight, but it is unclear if anyone will lead us tomorrow." Similar accounts reached British intelligence analysts, who noted an unsettling pattern: the sudden disappearance of high-ranking officers. Reports suggested that some commanders had been reassigned under mysterious circumstances, while others were captured or unaccounted for entirely. The precise reasons for these absences remained unknown, adding a layer of intrigue to the unfolding catastrophe and raising questions about internal security within the Soviet military. On the front lines, the struggle was brutal and immediate. German panzers, supported by mechanized infantry, advanced toward Mozhaysk, a strategic town 110 kilometers west of Moscow. Mozhaysk was fiercely defended by the Soviet 16th and 20th Armies, reinforced with hastily dug anti-tank lines and local militia. The defenders fought with determination, but their resources were thin. Luftwaffe attacks devastated supply lines, and German artillery pounded defensive positions relentlessly. The clash of steel and fire created a chaotic tableau: tanks bogged down in mud, infantry caught in crossfire, and civilians fleeing the advancing columns. The battle was emblematic of the broader struggle, a desperate attempt to hold a capital while facing an opponent with seemingly inexhaustible momentum. Amid the turmoil, Allied planners speculated about scenarios rarely considered in public. If Moscow fell, could Nazi forces consolidate control over the Soviet Union, or would partisan resistance erupt in the hinterlands? Could the loss of the city prompt the Soviets to consider negotiations or surrender? Such discussions remained confidential, but intelligence officers in London and Washington recognized the stakes. The Germans were not only fighting the Red Army, they were testing the limits of human endurance and command. Every intercepted signal, every missing officer, every battle report fed the growing narrative of uncertainty and suspense surrounding the fate of the Soviet capital. Within Moscow, preparations became increasingly frantic as winter loomed on the horizon. Troops were rotated in and out of defensive positions, barricades were reinforced, and civilians worked tirelessly to fortify streets and key installations. Yet, even with these efforts, gaps persisted in the defensive network. Some units were positioned incorrectly, others lacked sufficient ammunition, and command coordination remained a puzzle, complicated further by the disappearance of senior officers. Observers from the British and American embassies recorded these details meticulously, highlighting both the resilience and fragility of the Soviet war effort. In this delicate balance between collapse and defense, the city's fate remained uncertain. As the last weeks of October closed, German forces paused briefly, their supply lines stretched and their troops fatigued, yet the threat to Moscow was immediate and relentless. The city had become a symbol, a fulcrum upon which the future of Europe could pivot. Allied intelligence monitored every movement, every intercepted report, searching for clues about what could tip the balance. And behind the scenes, the mystery of vanished Soviet commanders lingered, a shadow in the fog of war. Could Moscow survive the approaching storm, or was its fall merely a matter of time? The answer remained hidden, and the tension, like the chill of the Russian autumn, tightened around the city. As November 1941 approached, the Russian landscape transformed under the first frosts of winter, turning rivers to ice and roads to treacherous mud. German Army Group Center, emboldened by months of rapid advances, was poised for a decisive push toward Moscow. Panzer divisions under Generals Hermann Hoth and Heinz Guderian spearheaded the assault, their tanks and mechanized infantry advancing along the vital highways connecting Smolensk, Vyazma, and ultimately the Soviet capital. Soviet defenses, hastily reorganized under General Georgy Zhukov, struggled to hold back the onslaught, deploying anti-tank brigades, entrenched infantry, and artillery units in improvised positions. The fate of Moscow, and by extension the Soviet Union, hung in the balance. British intelligence closely monitored the unfolding drama from afar. Reports from Soviet liaison officers indicated pockets of extraordinary resistance, yet contradictory accounts of missing or incapacitated commanders created a sense of unease. Intercepted communications hinted at vulnerabilities in Moscow's outer defensive lines, but the exact locations and strengths of these gaps were uncertain. Analysts in London debated potential outcomes, weighing the German army's momentum against the resilience of Soviet forces and the impact of the approaching winter. The stakes could not have been higher. If Moscow fell, the geopolitical map of Europe and Asia could be redrawn almost overnight. On the ground, the human struggle was raw and immediate. In Vyazma, the Soviet 19th and 20th Armies attempted a desperate defense against encircling German forces. Reports from soldiers describe roads clogged with retreating units, frozen equipment, and exhausted troops. Civilians joined the efforts, digging trenches, transporting supplies, and even manning defensive positions. Yet, amid the chaos, a shadow of fear lingered. The sudden disappearance of several senior officers left units leaderless at critical moments. Their fates, whether captured, reassigned, or killed, remained unknown, creating gaps in command that compounded the danger for those holding the front lines. The German assault, though methodical and brutal, was not without its own challenges. Logistics struggled under the rapidly approaching winter. Fuel shortages slowed panzers, while supply trains bogged down in mud and snow. The Luftwaffe, though dominant in the skies, faced extended operational lines and growing attrition from Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Yet, for all their difficulties, German forces continued to advance, pressing ever closer to the gates of Moscow. Observers in London and Washington could only speculate about the psychological impact of such pressure on both soldiers and civilians inside the city. Inside Moscow, preparations for a potential siege intensified. The Kremlin became a command hub for coordinating troop movements, civilian defense initiatives, and emergency supplies. Reservists and conscripts were deployed to critical points along the Moscow-Volokholamsk highway, where German forces were expected to strike first. Factories were converted into munitions depots, and hospitals stockpiled medical supplies in anticipation of casualties. But for every measure taken, uncertainty lingered. How resilient were these hastily fortified lines? Could they withstand the mechanized fury of the Wehrmacht, or would they collapse under concentrated fire? The city's defenders faced not just an external enemy, but the shadow of internal mystery. Missing officers whose absence could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The tension escalated as the first snow of late November blanketed the outskirts of Moscow. For German troops, the landscape presented new challenges. Icy roads slowed tanks, deepening snow-clogged artillery and supply wagons, and frostbite claimed its first victims. Soviet defenders, meanwhile, exploited their knowledge of the terrain, establishing ambush points and engaging in small-scale counterattacks to harass the advancing Germans. Diaries from the time describe a city and its defenders bracing against the onslaught. "We know they are close. Each night we hear the rumble of tanks. We do not sleep, but we endure." The human determination contrasted sharply with the mechanical precision of the invading forces. As November drew to a close, both sides were acutely aware that the coming weeks could decide Moscow's fate. For the Allies, monitoring every intercepted report became a tense exercise in foresight. Could the Soviets hold? Were there hidden vulnerabilities yet undiscovered? The mystery of missing commanders added a further layer of concern, leaving analysts to ponder whether the city's defenses were fully coordinated, or if a single gap could precipitate catastrophe. And as the chill of winter deepened, so too did the suspense, setting the stage for a confrontation that could determine not only the survival of Moscow but the broader trajectory of the Second World War. Winter had arrived in full force by early December 1941, transforming the Russian landscape into a frozen battlefield. Snow and ice turned rivers into impassable barriers and roads into treacherous tracks, but neither the Wehrmacht nor the Red Army could afford to pause. German Army Group Center, still advancing toward Moscow under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, faced increasingly desperate conditions. Tanks stalled in the snow, fuel shortages hindered mechanized units, and frostbite claimed thousands of soldiers. Yet, the Germans remained resolute, aware that capturing Moscow could potentially force the Soviet Union to capitulate. Every mile gained carried strategic weight, and every misstep could prove fatal. Soviet defenders, now under the determined leadership of General Georgy Zhukov, mobilized reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East, using rail lines to bring fresh troops to Moscow's outer defenses. Entire brigades, including elite ski troops and armored units, were deployed to reinforce critical positions along the Volokholamsk and Mozhaevsk defensive belts. Civilians were not idle. Men and women of the city dug trenches, transported supplies, and fortified streets with barricades. The combined effort was immense, but cracks remained. Some units were uncoordinated, communication lines were disrupted, and the sudden disappearance of senior officers continued to haunt the command structure, creating moments of vulnerability that both sides could sense. Allied observers, particularly in London and Washington, analyzed every fragment of intelligence with increasing fascination and concern. Reports indicated that while Soviet forces were stiffening, the German army's experience and tactics remained formidable. British intelligence speculated on whether the sudden loss or reassignment of key Soviet commanders might indicate internal purges, defections, or covert evacuations. These unanswered questions added an almost investigative dimension to wartime reporting, tracking not only troop movements but also the hidden dynamics that could tip the scales in Moscow's favor or doom it entirely. The fighting intensified along the approaches to the city. German panzers and infantry assaulted Soviet defensive lines, meeting fierce resistance at every bridge, forest, and village. Anti-tank obstacles and improvised fortifications slowed their progress, while Soviet artillery pounded advancing columns with deadly accuracy. Casualties mounted on both sides, and yet the rhythm of the battle was punctuated by moments of eerie stillness, where scouts reported missing Soviet officers or German columns paused for reasons that remain partially unexplained in surviving records. These anomalies, small in the context of the overall battle, cast a long shadow over the strategic picture, leaving commanders and analysts to wonder if unseen factors were influencing the outcome. Moscow itself became a city of extraordinary determination. Factories continued production of tanks and munitions, hospitals treated the wounded amid scarcity, and civil defense committees organized evacuation routes and emergency shelters. Yet, for every measure of preparation, there remained uncertainty. How effective were these reinforcements in real combat? Were missing commanders a result of chaos, betrayal, or a deliberate secret strategy? Observers recognized that such variables could prove decisive, especially in an environment where survival depended as much on timing and coordination as on raw firepower. By mid-December, the first Soviet counteroffensive began. Fresh Siberian divisions, acclimated to harsh winter conditions, launched attacks against German flanks, targeting supply lines and isolated units. The counterattack surprised the Germans, forcing them to consolidate positions and slow the drive toward Moscow. Diaries from soldiers on both sides captured the bewildering mixture of fear, exhaustion, and cautious optimism. "We thought they would overwhelm us, but the cold and the resilience of these troops has changed the rhythm. Moscow may yet hold." The psychological impact of winter, combined with the unexpected strength of Soviet reinforcements, injected a new layer of suspense into a battle that had seemed one-sided. As December progressed, Allied intelligence monitored the evolving situation with bated breath. Reports highlighted the extraordinary coordination and resilience displayed by Soviet forces, yet gaps in knowledge remained. Missing officers, fragmented communications, and inconsistent unit performance meant that even Moscow's defenders were uncertain of the city's fate. Behind every intercepted message, every reconnaissance report, lingered the question: could the Red Army push back the German advance before the city fell, or was the survival of Moscow still hanging by a thread? The answers remained just out of reach, leaving the world poised on the knife edge of history. By December 1941, the tide of battle around Moscow had begun to shift, but the scars of the near collapse were indelible. German forces, exhausted from months of relentless advance and unprepared for the severe Russian winter, faced a determined Soviet counteroffensive. The 5th, 10th, and 16th Soviet armies, bolstered by Siberian reinforcements transported under strict secrecy, struck at overextended German lines, targeting vulnerable supply convoys and isolated tank units. The Luftwaffe, previously dominant, struggled to maintain air superiority amidst freezing temperatures and mechanical failures. Moscow had survived the immediate threat, but the cost had been staggering, and many questions remained unanswered. Allied intelligence observed the unfolding events with a mixture of relief and unease. Reports from the field highlighted the incredible resilience of Soviet defenses, but also noted troubling anomalies. The sudden disappearance of key commanders persisted, with some officers unaccounted for weeks. British and American analysts speculated on the reasons behind these gaps. Were they casualties, secret redeployments, or covert evacuations orchestrated under orders from Stalin himself? These unresolved mysteries added layers of intrigue to an already dramatic military situation, prompting historians and intelligence officers alike to wonder how different the war might have been if Moscow had fallen. On the ground, the human struggle remained intense. Civilians, who had endured months of fear and deprivation, were pressed into service to support defensive operations. Factory workers doubled as firefighters and medics, while ordinary citizens manned barricades and assisted in the evacuation of vulnerable populations. Soldiers on both sides faced brutal conditions. Frostbite, hunger, and relentless artillery fire combined with the mental strain of prolonged combat. Memoirs from Red Army troops describe nights spent huddled in trenches, listening to the distant rumble of tanks and the occasional crackle of machine gun fire, never certain whether the next day would bring survival or annihilation. The German forces, meanwhile, faced a stark reckoning. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, with vehicles frequently immobilized in mud and snow. Infantry units were exhausted and morale began to waver as their advance stalled. Senior commanders, including General Heinz Guderian, noted in their diaries the unprecedented challenges. "The winter has become our fiercest adversary. Moscow remains unyielding, and our men struggle to maintain cohesion." Despite their discipline and previous successes, the Wehrmacht confronted an unexpected lesson in the limits of mechanized warfare under extreme conditions. Soviet counterattacks, carefully coordinated along the flanks and rear of German positions, began to reclaim lost ground. Towns like Volokholamsk and Mozhaysk, once teetering on the brink of occupation, were stabilized through a combination of strategic ingenuity and sheer determination. Yet even in these moments of tactical success, uncertainty lingered. Reports of missing officers raised questions about leadership effectiveness, chain-of-command integrity, and the broader implications for ongoing operations. Could Moscow truly be defended long-term, or had the city's survival been a temporary reprieve? For the Allies, the near collapse of Moscow offered both lessons and warnings. Intelligence reports emphasized the critical importance of morale, coordination, and rapid deployment of reinforcements. Strategists considered the potential global ramifications if Moscow had fallen. The German advance might have reached the Caucasus sooner, threatening vital oil supplies, or even compelled Britain to reconsider its position in North Africa and the Middle East. The delicate interplay of logistics, terrain, and human endurance demonstrated how the fate of a single city could ripple across continents, influencing decisions in war rooms thousands of miles away. As the year drew to a close, Moscow remained standing, but the shadow of its near defeat loomed large. Streets cleared of debris bore silent witness to the months of struggle, while forests and fields surrounding the city still held the scars of encirclement and retreat. Allied observers noted the resilience displayed by Soviet forces, but the enduring mysteries, vanished commanders, disrupted communications, and the exact moments when the city might have fallen, continued to fascinate and perplex. The survival of Moscow had altered the trajectory of the war, yet the fragile nature of that victory reminded the world that even the largest cities could teeter on the brink of catastrophe. As the first months of 1942 unfolded, reflection on the near fall of Moscow in late 1941 dominated strategic discussions across Allied command centers. The city had survived a monumental assault, but the implications of what almost occurred resonated far beyond Soviet borders. Historians, intelligence officers, and military planners debated the consequences. Had Moscow fallen, the German army might have consolidated control over Western Russia, potentially compelling the Soviet Union to negotiate or face further catastrophic losses. The very thought of a world split before the war's global climax became a haunting consideration in the minds of leaders from London to Washington. The mystery of missing Soviet commanders continued to perplex Allied analysts. Reports from Moscow were fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases deliberately obscured by wartime censorship. Some officers were later discovered to have been reassigned under Stalin's secret directives, others had been captured by German forces, and a few simply vanished without explanation. Each unexplained disappearance added a layer of intrigue to the narrative, underscoring the human cost and chaos behind the apparent order of military campaigns. For intelligence communities, these gaps in information were not merely curiosities. They represented potential turning points that could have drastically altered outcomes on the Eastern Front. In Moscow, the city itself began a slow recovery from months of siege-like conditions. Civilians returned to their homes where they had been forced to dig trenches or occupy improvised bunkers. Factories, now operating at near capacity, produced essential military equipment to support the Red Army's ongoing counteroffensives. Soviet troops, many of them recently reinforced by Siberian divisions, consolidated positions around the city and prepared for the next phase of operations. Yet, for all this resilience, there remained an awareness that the near collapse had been a narrow escape. Diaries from residents and soldiers alike capture a haunting blend of relief and lingering fear. "We survived, but we know how close the shadow came. The city feels alive, but the war is far from over." The survival of Moscow sent shockwaves through the Allied world. British strategists noted the resilience of Soviet forces and recalibrated their own military plans accordingly. American diplomats and intelligence officers examined the battle to draw lessons about supply chain management, winter warfare, and the importance of leadership continuity. Analysts recognized that the outcome had hinged on a fragile combination of geography, climate, and human determination. Every intercepted dispatch, every report of vanished officers, and every observed counterattack illustrated the precariousness of the situation, leaving open the possibility that a few different decisions could have led to catastrophe. The broader geopolitical ramifications of Moscow's survival became increasingly clear. A secure Soviet capital allowed the Red Army to mount sustained counteroffensives in the months that followed, eventually stabilizing the Eastern Front. For the Allies, this meant that the USSR could remain a viable partner in the global fight against the Axis, preventing a potential realignment that might have emboldened Germany to redirect forces toward the Middle East or the Western Front. Yet even as relief spread, the specter of what-if scenarios, where Moscow had fallen, commanders had vanished, and defenses had crumbled, lingered in strategic studies and historical analyses. These scenarios underscored the fine line between disaster and survival in total war. Reflecting on the near fall of Moscow, modern historians and military scholars emphasize the combination of factors that shaped the outcome. harsh winter conditions that stalled the Wehrmacht, the timely arrival of Siberian reinforcements, the resilience of both civilian and military defenders, and the shadowy influence of missing officers whose fates remain partially unresolved. The episode serves as a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of war, the fragility of command structures, and the extraordinary capacity of human endurance under pressure. It is a story where the line between victory and defeat was razor-thin, and where decisions, both documented and mysterious, had consequences that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. As Moscow stood resilient in the aftermath, the world slowly came to terms with the narrow margin by which history had been preserved. The near collapse had created a landscape of both achievement and enigma, a tapestry of courage, chaos, and unanswered questions. Allied planners, Soviet commanders, and civilians alike understood that the city's survival had bought time, but not guaranteed safety. The specter of a world split before it had fully formed remained a haunting memory, a reminder that in war, the course of history often hinges on moments unseen, decisions unrecorded, and fates left uncertain. And so, the story of Moscow in 1941 remains not just a tale of survival, but a meditation on the fragility, resilience, and enduring mystery at the heart of total war.